Welcome back to the Sikhistan Ministry of Fat Shaming. Today we're talking about the ideal physique for weightlifting, specifically in relation to our amateur weightlifters, so hopefully people who are not using performance enhancing drugs.
These weightlifters usually fall into two groups, right, where there's like an issue with the physique that's holding them back in their weightlifting. The first group is a group I'll talk about, is a group of people who are slightly too large, holding too much adipose tissue.
Just say it.
They're just too fat for weightlifting.
Okay.
It's holding them back, not only in their pursuit of competition success, so their weight class might be too high, but also in their general training and how well they're able to kind of hit the weights hard in training and get back and train again the next day. The second group is a group Gurf is going to talk about, and this is a group of people that might be slightly too light. They might be afraid to gain body weight, or they're struggling to gain body weight, and then they will not go up in weight class. It'll hold them back. They'll lose out on things like top end strength, stability, and ability to produce large amounts of power. So let's deal firstly with that initial group I talked about. The group that are slightly too fat, they're holding too much adipose tissue, and it's holding them back in their pursuit of weightlifting, either as an amateur sport or someday they might want to be a bit more competitive in it. We often hear the kind of 14% body fat number being thrown around as like the ideal athletic physique for natural people training normally. This number that's being thrown around is for field athletes. Most of the studies that throw the 14 or 15% body fat number around are from American football, soccer, rugby, and hockey are the studies we've seen, and these are distinctly different from weightlifting. So the first thing is, this is 14% by DEXA scan. So DEXA scan will get you basically a combination of subcutaneous adipose tissue. It will also get all of your internal adipose tissue, so like the fat that's around your heart, your kidney, your liver. It's not just the fat that's underneath your skin here, whereas just the calipers will be the kind of thing that's the only thing the calipers will catch. There are multiple other issues with calipers. Calipers are a good tool that can be useful in tracking your particular changes in subcutaneous adipose tissue, so the fat that lies just underneath the skin, but it's not a very good measure of measuring you against a percentage of lean tissue mass or you against another person in the population, but it can be quite good like week for week if you want to keep tracking and see how you're doing. The next issue is that weightlifting is a weight class sport. So you're inherently better at your sport of weightlifting. If you even lift the same numbers but you're lighter, you're a better competitor. If Owen is 70 kilos and he has a 300 kilo total and I'm 80 kilos and I have a 300 kilo total, Owen is much better than I am. So just having less mass on your frame tends to be a very good thing in weightlifting. You being lighter is better. Now, obviously, certain pieces of mass like our bone structure, our lean tissue mass, our tendon mass, all of these things are very beneficial for weightlifting because they allow us to impart force into an object or impart force into the ground. And stuff like subcutaneous adipose tissue, general fatness isn't useful. So that's kind of where we'd like to trim that weight off from. The next thing is, when we look at the other sports where this 14 or 15% body fat number is thrown around with, oftentimes have impact involved with them. Now it can be a very small amount of impact, like in a soccer match, like in a basketball game where there might be an elbow, a shoulder thrown, you might be falling against the floor, or it could be quite a large amount of impact, such as rugby, American football, ice hockey, something like that. Just the presence of subcutaneous adipose tissue can act as a very good buffer against this impact. So whether it is my shoulder landing against the ground, my back landing against the ground, a shoulder coming into my midriff, just having that packaging of adipose around a joint, around your soft internal organs can be very good to protect against certain amounts of injuries. Also, due to the hormonal profile and how your adipose tissue regulates hormones, can be quite good in terms of a protective mechanism against certain injuries. The last thing, and this is the most important thing that people kind of need to get into their heads around weightlifting and the kind of mass moves mass thing, is when you look at inertia, momentum, and how our mass interacts with other masses, right? So mass, the amount of stuff that is within us. When we look once again at the 14 or 15% body fat that you'll talk about with field athletes, a lot of the time they're impacting other people, and they want that impact to have the most momentum possible, right? So if you look at kinetic energy, right, the energy coming from something moving, it's like m times v squared. So m, our mass, times our velocity squared. The mass is inherently important to how much kinetic energy we have coming into something. So me and Owen are playing a game of American football, or we're ice skating, and we're colliding into each other, and we want to make a big impact on the other person. Owen is coming in with his mass, so his mass is 20 kilos, and that's 20 kilos by v squared. My mass is coming in at 30 kilos, and that's 30 kilos by v squared. Assuming we're moving at the same speed, the resultant vector is going to go in this direction, right? So your speeds are different coming in, your speed's the same coming in, your mass is different, so the one with the bigger mass will just end up pushing in that direction. That's inherently useful in other sports. It's not useful in weightlifting or powerlifting. In weightlifting or powerlifting, me and the barbell are one integrated system. So that center of gravity of the barbell combined with the person is the same, and I'm not necessarily coming in with kinetic energy, so I'm not coming in with that mv squared formula. I'm coming in with no energy, and we're starting from a static position. Although we might have a slightly dynamic start, it's not going to make much of a difference. So ideally now, if you're in this group, what kind of body fat percentage are you aiming for? Well, you're certainly aiming to be as lean as you can possibly be, particularly if you're in the heavier class. So if you're looking at yourself now and you say, okay, bit of fluff here, I'm probably not in the greatest shape. The main thing I would say is that for most athletes, you're talking about going all the way down to 11, 10, 9% body fat before you actually start to see real decrements in performance. So just keep getting leaner would be my main piece of advice.
There's two other reasons maybe why you would also want to be getting leaner. One, as an amateur athlete, you should probably be looking to have a more favourable body composition for your how you feel day to day. You know, your sporting performance will be affected. Things like sleep will be much better. Your long-term health, though, is something that's very important there. So if you are an amateur athlete and you're a lot heavier, you need to be weighing up the risks of being heavier, a higher body fat percentage, maybe a higher BMI, compared to something a little bit healthier. So there's obviously reasons why you'd want to be better and lighter weight or less body fat for sports performance, but also you should be considering your long-term health. You know, it's unlikely you get paid for weightlifting. The other caveat then is super heavies are kind of anomalies in relation to this. So everything under the super heavy weight class this would apply to. The likelihood is, though, we don't see a lot of amateur super heavyweights, and if we do, they certainly do need to lose weight. These people are often, I suppose, for want of a better word, they are obese. So if we see them in the amateur scene, they are someone who is probably someone who is quite unhealthy. Now, our super heavies at the elite level scene are also very unhealthy, but these are anomalies in terms of sheer mass. So these people are very, very tall. They carry a lot of mass naturally and unnaturally, while still being able to move very, very fast at these heavy weights. They're able to move their own body weight very fast. They are also able to keep their mobility very well at these heavy body weights, and even at the dosages of performance enhancing drugs they might be taking. These things, for them, these are kind of anomalies, and you'll know if you're a good super heavyweight because you'll be cleaning like 220 kilos or something like that. So for everyone else, if you're an amateur weightlifter and you're super heavyweight and you're 5'10", it's probably not a great place to be in relation just for your general health, and just have a think about that in relation to why that might be happening. Also, one of the reasons as well these super heavyweights are able to kind of do what they do is not because they have extra fat, it's because it's easier to maintain more muscle mass at those weights with that surplus calories. So next we move on to the second group, so from the amateur weightlifters. We see people who are just too skinny, and this is probably mostly what we see these days, is people who are just kind of they're not shredded with a lot of muscle mass. They're just very, very lean, but they're also skinny. They have low levels of muscle mass and body fat. These are the ones we see frequently, kind of between 65 and 75 kilos. Oftentimes these are, funnily enough, the people who worry most about their physique. So we'll see our heavier lifters or amateur lifters won't worry that much about it. We'll see our skinnier lifters will actually spend more time musing and kind of chewing over what they, no pun intended, chewing over what they want to be like. So they're always kind of, I've gained a little bit of weight, and they'll go from like 70 to 73 kilos, and they'll be like, oh no, I've gotten kind of fat, So it's funny that we see these people, the skinnier lifters, are not funny and haha, but it's interesting that we see with these skinnier lifters are people who worry more about their physique in terms of how it looks compared to our kind of fatter lifters, I should say. So why would you want to gain more lean mass? So ultimately in weightlifting, you want to be able to produce as much force as quickly as possible. Now for each barbell we lift, there's a minimum requisite of force you need to apply to the barbell to move it fast enough for you to get under. You don't need unlimited levels of force. You don't need maximum powerlifting levels of force. You don't need maximum squat, bench and deadlift, which as we've talked before could actually be detrimental for your ability to produce force quickly. But you still need a prerequisite level of force, and the only thing that produces force in our body directly is contractile tissue. Now tendons and ligaments attenuate force and increase them, which is why weightlifting kind of happens in general. All our tendons and ligaments act as a system and it's not an isolated movement, but that base force is generated from our muscle mass, our contractile tissue. It's not generated from the tendons. They increase and they can amplify and sometimes dampen the force we produce, but that muscle mass is the one producing the force. An 180 kilo barbell has a minimum requisite of force to get it moving off the ground at a particular velocity for you to get under. Now, some people can fire faster, can produce more force with less muscle units, have better quality muscle fiber composition, fast twitch fibers. That's why they're elite weightlifters. But as an amateur lifter, you know, the force you impart to get under 100 kilo clean is much different to the force you can impart under 150 kilo clean. So ultimately you will get a stage where you will hit weights where you're not able to produce enough force to get beyond those. That's why we see weight classes, because the heavier weight class, the more muscle mass you have, the more force you can produce, and then ultimately they're weightlifters, so they can produce it very fast and they can get under the barbell quickly. So that is one of the first reasons. Second reason then is you're more likely to have contractile tissue and better quality stability in your lifts, so your knee stability, shoulder stability. You're more likely to have better quality tendon and ligament growth. You're more likely to be in a caloric surplus that allows for better release of natural hormones, you know, things like growth hormone between the periods of like 11 and 2 o'clock at night. You'll probably get better quality sleep. You will have just better quality tissue in general if you increase your muscle mass a little bit. There'll be more available for your body. So there's a prerequisite amount of bone tissue, organ tissue, ligaments and stuff like that that'll need to be there to live. But for weightlifting, obviously, like we talked about, you want more muscle mass. So increasing your body weight will most likely, if you continue to train and you get adequate amounts of protein, you will most likely end up with better contractile tissue. Now, this obviously, for a different conversation, is how fast and how much you gain. But for now, you want to be thinking about getting beyond that and gaining a little bit of weight. There's also that option then when you're gaining weight, the more calories you have, the more you are able to train, the more sessions you're able to do without feeling like shit. So as an amateur weightlifter, you probably work a full-time job, you're probably a student, you could be a student working a job, you may have a family, you may have a lot of other responsibilities in day-to-day life. So all of these things consume calories and mental energy. And if you're gaining body weight, you will likely be able to train a lot more because you'll have potentially more energy available to you. Now, once you get to a certain point, this will peak, so you won't be able to do this indefinitely. But if you're going from 70 to 80 kilos, the amount of volume you can do in training, specifically in your high force movements, your squat, your deadlift and your pressing movements, will be increased, and this will allow you to gain more muscle mass. More muscle mass requires more calories. It's an expensive apparatus for your body to hold. It's very, very useful for increasing your resting metabolic rate. More muscle tissue just burns more calories at rest. So you're not really burning more training, but the more muscle tissue you have, the more calories you can eat. The more calories you can eat, the more you can fill out your weight class, the more training you can do, the better you can get your squat, the more you can get your high force movements up higher. So hopefully then this will translate to a better weightlifter. Now, there is a point of diminishing returns as a weightlifter where your power to weight ratio will get terrible, where it won't be very, very good. You won't be able to express the force as fast as possible. For example, with super heavyweights, we'll have an alteration of technique. So, for example, they will have to move the barbell around their belly if they have a particular body composition like that. Every centimeter the barbell moves away from your center of mass, you could be adding up to 10 kilos of the weight on the barbell or the difficulty to it. You also eventually will get to a weight where you have to actually encounter and take into account that every time you stand up from a clean or stand up from a snatch, you're also lifting your own body weight. So you have an excess of maybe 20-30 kilos of fat mass, which is not something you want to be doing. So there is a point of diminishing returns where if you gain too much body mass, so most likely will be adipose tissue after a period of time. But for most people, People focus on that end of the issue too much. When we're a skinny amateur weightlifter, oftentimes we worry too much about getting a little bit too fat, and we imagine ourselves being a 110 kilo super. The likelihood is you're probably not going to end up at 110 kilos. Although I did start weightlifting at 75 and I peaked at 110. That's by and by though, as we saw from the genetics thing. My genetics are prone to that. But most likely for most people, if you're 70 kilos now, being 85 kilos or 80 kilos in 3-4 years time is a nice goal. You know, just gain a little bit more, look at your body composition. Could you have more muscle mass? Are your strength lifts stalling at the moment? Could they be a little bit better? One very, very important thing as well is if you find yourself cutting to a lower class, it is one of the key indicators of how you're going to stunt your growth later. So this is one of the things that Soviets talked about, was restricting body weight was one of the best ways to restrict your performance later in career. So there's some very, very good data on this across thousands of lifters, especially at a young age. So if we're an 18-year-old and we continue cutting, and at 19 we keep cutting back, and at 20 we cut back to that same weight class, you will restrict your progress. Eventually you will cap the top end because you're wasting years, and eventually it kind of gets to the stage where you're wasting training years. So it's an interesting concept. So don't spend too much time cutting down on weight classes. Only cut to a weight class is if you are either too fat or you're not competitive. So don't worry about that as a skinny weightlifter. Just think about, I'm going to gain a little bit more muscle mass. If you get a little bit fluffy, that's not a problem. If you're in a very skinny camp, you can always lose that fat later, and you'll certainly, if you do correctly, have a bit more muscle mass.
The last thing I'd like to finish with on this topic is, for longevity of both you within your particular sport and longevity of the sport itself, it's better if you're in better shape, right? So a lot of us fall into the trap of, particularly early on in your training career, you might be 3 or 4 years into training, you're kind of getting into it now, you're getting an idea for what's happening, and you'd say, oh, I don't care how big I get, I want to squat this number, I want to deadlift this number, I want to snatch this, I don't care what physique I have when I get there. In terms of you being a good athlete for much, much longer and having that higher ceiling like what Garth told you about earlier, it's very important you stay in good shape, because although you might really love powerlifting now and you mightn't care about not being in great shape, you will care at some point, and it's just easier if you keep it all under control for a small bit longer, just stay in slightly better shape. It's a lot easier to hold on to that later on in life.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, thanks very much for watching. I hope this was enjoyable for you. We don't talk about physique and stuff a huge amount because it's not our particular area. We're very much in sports performance. But this, for us, is a performance issue for weightlifters. It's where a lot of weightlifters kind of mess up their own performance. If you have questions about this, pop them down in the comments below. If there's something you don't agree with, you can pop them down in the comment. We'll just downvote the comment in here, so it doesn't really matter. Like, nobody will see it. So we do really appreciate that kind of feedback and you bouncing back off us. If you're interested in what we do with our weightlifters, go and check out the link below. It's a link to the weightlifting block programs, link to the beginner weightlifting program, and you'll get to see all the kind of training that our weightlifters do. You'll have access to us in the Facebook coaching group. So yeah, thanks for watching. We'll see you all again soon.
The Facebook.
The Facebook.
The Facebook.
The Facebook.